Hello everybody, and welcome to my big ugly spreadsheet. So what I've got here is a spreadsheet that I created in Microsoft Excel. I kind of just whipped it up sort of quickly. I didn't really have a really well thought out plan as I was doing it, so it's a little rough to look at. I kind of tried to doll it up a little bit, but what I've got here is a bench racing tool. um, this is something that I've made spreadsheets like this before, but I wanted to kind of put together a little video showing exactly how this works so you could make your own spreadsheet. Or I've been thinking what I need to actually do is probably make a Google Sheets and share it so that, people that don't necessarily want to get down into the nitty gritty details can just use it as a tool. But what we've got here is a tool that will take torque values, like what's derived from an engine dyno or from a dyno in general, and uses those torque values along with gear ratios and your tire size in order to show how much force you're exerting on the road, basically. The actual force in pounds that the tire patch, of your wheels, of your tires, are imparting into the ground in order to accelerate the vehicle. So the way it's doing that is at any given RPM, we've got a torque value, which we can see over here on the very far left. These are our RPMs values. Oh, and this is two different setups here, so this is used to compare. But so our first one here, we've got our RPM and our torque values here. So we've got from 2,000 to 8,000 RPM, and here's some torque values. These torque values here are these are estimates that I created that would have been for my Honda B20 VTEC setup that was in my CRX up until recently. What I did to make these is I had a real dyno that I did of my B16, which is a 1.6 liter, and I just scaled those with displacement up to what the torque values should in theory be um, with 2 liters of displacement. So if I recall correctly, it ended up being a little north of 200 horsepower. That's what this first engine is. It's the B20 VTEC. I've got the gear ratios. So this is multiplying for every gear, multiplying by that gear ratio. So we've got first gear, second, third, fourth, fifth. There's no sixth, so it just has 0. And then the final drive ratio, the ratio that's multiplying each gear afterwards. I know it's technically not called final drive if you want to be a stickler. I know there's probably going to be somebody in the comments that'll bring that up, but we've got the gear ratio multiplied by that final ratio, and then it's calculating the circumference of the tires. So I added a field here where you can put in the tire size, and it's able to calculate the tire diameter, and then divide that axle torque finally by this final divider, which would then get us the actual force like at the tire. And I didn't do that at first. That's why this is kind of over here on the far right and not over here with the other values that are entered. Because at first I wasn't even really considering the tire size, because I was really just thinking, I wasn't going to make this a video. This was just, my own bench racing that I wanted to do. And I wasn't really thinking about changing tire size. I'm just thinking same car. All I'm doing is putting a different engine, different transmission in it. I want to see, how much faster it's going to be, essentially. Um, all said and done, all those things are calculated. It ends up outputting all right here in these fields. So again, I know it's kind of an ugly spreadsheet. I'll if I make it in a Google Sheet, I'll try and doll it up a little bit, make it a little easier to use. It should have really been done on multiple sheets to make it, less ugly. But all the info is right here. All the output is just all over the place. So what we've got here is first gear, the speed that's derived you know, and then how that's the scale essentially, and then this is the actual torque, or the how the torque is multiplied to get the sort of force at the tire. So believe it or not, you know, we got 2,000 pounds of force acting on that little tire in first gear on that car. So over 2,000 pounds of force. So I guess it's not surprising that it likes to spin them pretty bad. But and then we've got second gear, third, fourth, fifth, and then sixth is it's dividing by 0. So we've just got an error here because there is no sixth gear. And then all that is then plotted in this graph here. So the blue line represents this engine, the B20V Tech. And what we're able to see here is we've got speed along our x-axis, and then our independent variable is the force, you know, along the y here. So you could essentially think of this like a plot of how much force is being put to the ground along with speed. So if you were to wrap it out through each gear, you would see this amount of force being applied. So you can kind of think of it as like a little drag simulator. If we ignore the red, because that's this other engine here, but if we follow this blue line, this is kind of what it would do in first gear, assuming it could hook up and not just spin, which is what it did in real life. At the top of first gear at 8,000 RPM, you would upshift. Force drops down to here. This is now accelerating from 40 miles per hour up to about 60. Less force being put to the ground, less tire spin. That's just how gearing works, so that brings us up to 60. Upshift into third, follows along through third gear, shift into fourth, wrap fourth gear all the way out if you want to get a speeding ticket, drop into fifth and wrap it out. And then, looks like I could probably have only squeezed a little over 140 miles per hour out of that transmission, assuming I was only revving to 8,000 RPM. Now what I've done here is just duplicated this whole thing again, and I have another engine and transmission that I am comparing the B20 VTEC setup to. So this was a B20 VTEC with a B16 transmission. For the Honda guys out there that know what that means, it's a real short ratio 5-speed transmission. Real good road racing kind of ratios. Definitely designed for like a high revving engine. Even spinning 8,000 RPM, it's not hitting 40 miles per hour in first gear, if that gives you an idea of how short we're talking about. So now what we've got here is these torque numbers came from a dyno I found online of a Honda K24 with kind of full bolt-ons and a good tune. So, this is the hot K24 that's rated at 200 horsepower from the factory. When you, put a good header on it and intake and, a good tune, people are getting like, 220, maybe even like 230 horsepower at the wheels out of them, which is pretty astonishing. This is that K24 engine. This is, I think, a pretty reasonable expectation of torque numbers that it could output. If you didn't guess, this is what's going into my CRX. So that's why I was doing this. So K24 engine, these gear ratios are from I believe it'd be a 2012 to a 2015 Civic Si. So that's the K24Z7, if I remember correctly. You can see here we've got the same tire size in here like I just described. Again, calculating all of these numbers based on these torque values, these gear ratios. And that is this red line here. And as you can see, right from the beginning with first gear, it's quite a lot higher. Again, because the gear ratios end up being fairly close to the same, you could see, we're hitting about 35 miles per hour in first as opposed to 37 at 8,000 RPM. So it's actually slightly shorter. And that follows all the way through. On the B16, we did 37, then almost 60, and then 85 through the first three gears. On here, it's 35, 56, and then 80. And then that kind of carries along. And then, of course, we've got this longer 6 gear. So it will actually wrap out to about 170 plus miles per hour, as opposed to being limited at 140-ish with the B16 in fifth. But so because the ratios end up being about the same, bigger engine, 2.4 liter compared to a 2 liter, we end up with loads more torque. Every gear is better across the board. And here's where the bench racing comes in. Here's where this is an excellent bench racing tool, because you could use this to compare any number of setups. It doesn't even have to be the same car, although this does not take into account weight of the vehicle. So that might be something I'll add. Then you could really compare like just about anything. We could maybe get really crazy and add in frontal area and drag coefficient, and then we could, you would, sky's the limit. Then you could really get an excellent comparison, even taking into account drag at higher speeds. But what we've got here, assuming same weight of the vehicle, we can almost imagine like a little drag race here. We've got the blue line, B20, red line, K24. First gear, we've got more force being imparted to the ground through the entirety of that gear. So assuming it would hook up, the car with the K24 would immediately be faster. Significantly so. I mean, if we think of this as like a percentage, here we're at 2,000 to 2,300. This kind of curve is moving between 2,500 and maybe 2,800, so pretty significant percentage increase in force, in torque. So now I know what's going to happen in real life, and maybe someone would bring this up. The car can't hook up in first. I'm not big on drag racing. I'm not going to put great big slicks on it, so it's going to have little tires on it. So let's just ignore first gear. First gear is a wash. It's just going to blow the tires off, but they're going to accelerate roughly the same, spinning through first, and then we're going to hit second. And here's where we would drop down. So imagine just a straight line down from where they both shift at around 35 to 37 miles per hour. And here is second gear playing itself out. So if you can imagine, this is a sort of volume inside here. In this area between the red line and the blue line, imagine that volume. That volume is how much faster the red line is than the blue. That is the kind of total amount of improved acceleration through that gear. So through second, it's going to kill it. We hit third, same story. It's not surprising stuff. I mean, this, of course, K24 is going to be faster than B20V tech, or at least with these two setups. So now what's interesting about this, and this is going beyond just talking about racing, this imaginary drag race that we're doing here, is just thinking about how the car is going to feel. So down here, like in fifth gear, for instance, this is the blue line's fifth gear with the B16. You can see it aligns pretty well with the red line, which is the sixth gear with the K series. And I'll tell you something, with that short B16 transmission and that B20 VTEC setup, or even when it still had the B16, that fifth gear felt short enough that of course, if you really wanted to go somewhere in a hurry, you had to downshift. But when you're already turning 4,000 RPM, in fifth gear, which is all the time, unless you only wanted to go 45 miles per hour, you could get on it and it would still accelerate. So the car was light enough that even with a B16 in fifth gear, it would still accelerate pretty easily. So this is kind of exciting to me because I'm thinking, not only do I have this much longer sixth gear that's going to allow me to cruise at a lower RPM and whatnot, but even still, because of the increased displacement, this car is still going to pull just as hard in sixth gear as the old setup did in fifth. And you kind of see that relationship hold true uh, uh, with the fifth and fourth gear as well, where the fourth gear with the K series is going to feel kind of similar to what the B20V Tech setup felt like in third gear. Just kind of a cool thing, it's interesting just to be able to imagine what it's going to feel like before I actually have it all together and I'm actually driving it. It's exciting just to know how much faster it's going to be. It kind of really motivates me to get it done. So I think what I'll do here, I'm going to go ahead and add in the mass, um, so we can see what happens with a different weight. Actually, you know what? Before I do that, let's just look at what like tire size does. Let me give you some examples. Let's play with the numbers here. All I've done here is describe it. Let me show you, some changes. So I mentioned before that this more modern, K series transmission engine, it's designed for a later Civic. They're bigger and heavier and they have bigger diameter tires. So if we take into account, let me Google real quick what the tire size was on a let's say like a 2012 Civic SI tire size. Ran a 215 45 17, so significantly larger. 215 45 17. You see all the numbers updating here. Now that kind of narrowed the gap a little bit here. If you were watching, this red line dropped down because there was a reduction in the amount of force being applied to the road, because some of that gearing advantage of the small tire was removed. So we went to a larger diameter tire. We lost some of that gearing effect, some of that torque multiplication effect. And what we have now is that each gear is now revving out to a little bit of a higher speed. It actually really made them where they're like really like identical gearing before. I said they were identical before, but with the tire size taken into account, I guess a modern-ish Civic Si really has gear ratios that, when you take into account the tire size, are like almost identical to an old B16. So it's kind of cool. A lot of people, myself included, sometimes criticize Honda for losing its roots, but you see something like that and you got to think that there's people there that are really still dedicated to the old screaming, naturally aspirated spirit of the old Honda cars. So yeah, even this 12 to 15 Civic had some pretty short gear ratios, just with a much bigger engine now. So and what you can see here is this force divider changed. We've got where it's actually before it was actually still, pardon me, got terrible allergies. With this previous force divider, we were actually still multiplying the torque by dividing the axle torque by this 0.96 to get the force at the wheels. So and that's because the tire diameter is, or really I should say the tire radius is slightly under 1 foot. And since we're talking foot pounds, you can see that it actually makes kind of perfect sense when you look at these numbers here. If you've got 2,000 foot-pounds at the axle in first gear, and then your tire diameter is roughly a foot, you're going to end up with roughly 2,000 pounds of force acting on that contact patch, applying the force to the ground. So with the larger diameter wheels and tires on this later setup, see we increase that diameter a fair bit. Now we're actually dividing that torque number down to get a force number that's a little bit less than the torque number. So that kind of narrowed it a bit. Let's go crazy with it though. I can't even think of a crazy big tire size that would even fit on a Civic, but let's just imagine that we put like some enormous like 22-inch wheels on here with like little rubber band tires. Let's do like a 30 sidewall 22-inch wheel. So big impact there. This is why the big wheels make you slow. This is why when you put the great big tires on your truck or on any vehicle, the larger diameter, it slows you down. You're literally accelerating more slowly through each gear. The gear might take you to a little bit of a higher speed now, but that doesn't make you faster. This is, we've now managed to take our K24 and kind of bring it down to where it's the race would probably be pretty even, and we did that simply by putting enormous wheels and tires on the car. So it makes a big difference. You could do this, you could have the same effect with the gear ratios. If we put this back to a normal tire size, normal, like, pretty small tire size, like what goes on a CRX. But let's put in some different gear ratios here. Let's say that I had cheaped out a little bit, which I was really tempted to, and gotten a cord transmission. They're a lot less expensive than the 6-speed Civic Si transmissions, and they have longer gear ratios, and they don't have a limited slip differential and whatnot. So let's see here. Let me just look this up real quick. K-Series transmission gearing.
On it.
Oh, Siri thinks I'm talking to her. Go away.
Still working.
She'll give up eventually. All right. So I got some gear ratios here.
Wrong. Please try again.
Unbelievable. So I've got some 5-speed gear ratios here. This would be a 2003 to 2007 Accord. So that's a K24 A4, I guess. So it's a K24. I think that was the lesser output one. It was more like 160 horsepower because it didn't have the real 3-lobe VTEC. But let's just put these kind of gear ratios in here and see how this affects it. So we got a first gear of 3.266, 1.769 on the second, 1.147, 0. This is really small text. It's hard to read. Okay, so that's all the gear ratios, and then the final drive is also has less of a ratio. It's a 4.389. So yeah, pretty substantial difference here. This kind of accomplished the same thing as those great big wheels did. We're now very, very close through all of the gears except for first is still, very short, like the B16. But everything else is kind of like evened out as far as the force level with how much longer these gears are. So you see now, second gear is going all the way to 70 miles per hour, and third is going to 109. So that's some pretty long gear ratios. Um, and even with that much higher ratio, or I guess it's a lower ratio, but longer gears, um, we're still imparting a pretty similar amount of torque to the ground. So this would really kind of even the cars up. Going from that that really excellent B16 transmission to now we've got the big K24, but we put the lower performance Accord transmission behind it. We've now kind of achieved a similar level of performance. Although I'm sure the fuel economy would be really good with the long Accord box. Um, but what really turned me off from this, using this transmission, is really the gear spacing. So you've still got this really short first, and then you hit it with a comparatively quite long second gear. So the effect of that is, once you wrap out that first gear, you get into second, you're dropping to a lower RPM where you're getting kind of off of that torque peak. You can see it's kind of dropping down here where, especially if you short shifted it a little bit, you're going to drop way down here below where the engine's really making its best torque. And then on top of that, you're just losing that mechanical advantage of the gearing. And then also it didn't have a limited slip differential, which was a big thing for me because I plan on doing some road racing with it. So to me, that was a really critical upgrade, and it was worth every cent. But again, bench racing. I mean, this is what this is all about here. This is a really good bench racing tool. Instead of just kind of doing you know, the mental math and say, oh, this car's got that and that car's got that, you can really put the numbers in here. You can calculate the gear ratios and how it affects everything, and you can get kind of at least put some real numbers behind it. More so than you can just guesstimate. So let me go ahead and rework this to take into account the mass, the weight of the vehicle. It should just be a real simple little addition, and I'll show you kind of how that comes into play. So just give me a couple minutes. I'll speed the video up so it'll just take a couple seconds for you guys. All right, welcome back. So real quick job. All I did was add in this weight value that is on both of our setups. And what we can do with this, or what it's doing, is it's taking the force that we were graphing before, that we were plotting, that force that was the wheels force acting on the ground to accelerate the vehicle, and we're now dividing that force by mass, by the weight of the vehicle. So you may have learned in high school physics class, that very simple formula that force is equal to mass times acceleration. So we can flip that around a little bit, and what we've done here is we've divided that force by mass, and what we're left with is acceleration. So what we've now got plotted is the actual acceleration of the vehicle. We've got kind of almost exactly like what we started with, except you'll see our scale is now in a much different unit, much smaller number. We've got the same tire size here with that same force divider, and we've got the same weight. So inevitably, that K-Series engine and the transmission too are going to be a little heavier than the B-Series setup was. So I don't know exactly how much the car weighs, honestly, but let's assume that we may have added 100 pounds to it. It might be more than that. It might be 150 pounds. Let's just try and narrow the gap. Let's say that all said and done, we added 200 pounds to the car by putting the big engine in it. And what we should see here is that red line decrease. I only saw it change for the first gear. Oh, I messed it up. Let me fix this real quick. What is it? 42. I must have messed up with a copy and paste here. So you can see what if you can make it out with the resolution. Basically, what this formula is it's multiplying the torque by the gear ratios and then dividing by the tire ratio, if you will, and then finally we're dividing by the weight. So it's a very simple formula. Considering the comments that you guys have been leaving on my videos, I think I've got some pretty smart subscribers. So if you guys haven't already done this yourselves, I'm sure you'll figure this out like it's nothing. But I still plan on making a Google Sheet version as well for you guys that either can't figure it out or can't be bothered. There's nothing wrong with that. We all have stuff going on that takes up our time, and sometimes laboring over a spreadsheet is not what you want to do with your spare time. All right, so let's just, for dramatic effect, let's go back to our 2,000 pounds so we can kind of see the difference. So here we are, all things being equal, except we magically gained 0.4 liters and some good gear ratios. And let's go ahead and tack on that extra 200 pounds, and boom, brought everything down. Dragging around that extra weight, it did narrow the gap a fair bit. I mean, assuming you were equal up until this point where there's a crossover, the B series setup is actually pulling a little higher, kind of right there at the very top of those gears. But that's assuming that the K24 didn't already blow past it, which is what would happen. Let's go further though. So you know what? This is a really good test, a real world test that we can do. We did it before with the tire size. So let's go ahead and put that tire size back in there. I think it was a 215 40 17. I don't quite remember. Let me look it back up. 215 45 17. So the bigger diameter wheels on that 2012 Civic Si, and then let's find out 2012 Civic Si curb weight. So Google is telling me 2,800, 2,900 pounds. Just for the benefit of the doubt, let's say that you took that spare tire out. We'll just call it 2,800 pounds. So with now what we've got is an 89 Honda CRX with a B20V tech and a B16 transmission on the top, and a, relatively speaking, new-ish 2012 Civic Si on the bottom here, the red line. And you can see how huge that weight is. I mean, dragging around another 800 pounds took that, excellent K24 engine with, as we discussed previously, excellent transmission, and across the board, it's slower. That CRX with that, good old B series, 30-year-old B series setup in it, would, you know what it is? Siri thinks B series. That's what she's picking up on.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Stop.
There's nothing to stop you. Check if the device is on your home Wi-Fi network.
Unbelievable. Anyway, So dragging around that extra 800 pounds really slowed the car down. I mean, if we were again going to imagine our imaginary drag race, between these two cars, we've got it plotted right out here in acceleration. Across the first gear, second gear, third gear, this blue line is higher. The That CRX is just going to be faster. They're going to shift at about the same points, as we saw with that tire size. It really makes the gear ratios effectively like identical. So they're going to shift at the same speed, but the CRX is going to get there first. It's going to hit second before the later car does, the big car does. It's going to hit third before it does. It's just going to go through the gears faster. It's just going to be faster. So we just took our bench racing tool to one step higher, and you could use this for anything. I could compare a turbo Honda to a F-body Camaro. Would be probably a really cool comparison to make. And of course, it's just a tool. It's not going to take into account everything, but I think it's pretty useful. So I hope you guys got some enjoyment out of this. I know this was very impromptu and different than things I've made before. I've got another video I'm working on that is it's turned into like a real bear. It's a lot of information. It's hard to parse it out. So I just wanted to make something quick. Hopefully it doesn't have too much rambling in it, like I'm doing right now. But hopefully this taught you something and was useful in some way. I do want to work on that Google Sheet, get that out ASAP so that you guys can play around with this. And in the meantime, boot up Excel or whatever you use, whatever spreadsheet software you use, and make something yourself if you want. But stay tuned. Please subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I've got a lot of stuff on a lot of stuff in the works. So until next time.